She said they were vitamins. For my nerves, she said, the way people talk to a child who has asked too many questions. Every morning, after Adam left for work, she'd set a little white cup by my tea, 2 soft capsules inside, and she'd smile that bright managerial smile of hers and say, "Go on, Mom, it's time for your wellness routine." I took them because that's what gratitude looks like. When you've moved into your son's house after a hip surgery, you couldn't afford to recover from alone. I took them because it felt polite. I'm 78 years old, and I still say please and thank you to people who slowly erase me. That's the training of a lifetime. I live alone now in a small apartment over a laundromat, the kind of place that always smells faintly of detergent and steam. It's quiet here, except for the dryers thumping below. The walls are thin, but they belong to me. Sometimes, when I hear the hum from downstairs, it sounds almost like breathing, steady, loyal, alive. I didn't know I'd been dying in slow motion until a stranger told me so. I suppose every woman of my age carries a private list of humiliations we've decided to call misunderstandings. Mine began the day Lisa started helping with my pills. I'd been staying with Adam and her for just 3 months after the fall. They'd remodeled the guest room into something between a nursery and a hospital ward. White walls, laminated floors, no clutter. They said clutter made me anxious. What they meant was they didn't want my things around. I used to keep photographs on the dresser, small frames with faces that smiled for me once, but one morning they were gone. Lisa said the cleaning service probably moved them into storage for safety. She said it so easily that I almost believed her. That's how it starts, not with shouting, but with rearranging. I remember thinking that Lisa's house always smelled like citrus disinfectant and silence. She spoke softly, efficiently, like she'd memorized the script of kindness, but not the feeling. Adam was busy, always leaving. He'd kiss my forehead before work, check his watch, promise to have dinner with me soon. I stopped believing that promise around week 2, but I never stopped wanting it to be true. Every evening, Lisa would plate my dinner separately, low salt, low fat, low everything, and remind me to take my vitamins. The first few times, I felt grateful. I even told the ladies from my old book club that my daughter-in-law was taking such good care of me. It made me sound lucky, and I wanted to sound lucky. I'd never lived with them before. We were a modern family, as Lisa liked to say, which meant I paid my own bills and didn't ask to stay for holidays. She'd invite me for Easter every other year, and I'd bring lemon cake that the children never touched. The pills began the second week. Small, beige, tasteless. I thought nothing of it until I realized I was losing hours. I'd sit by the window after breakfast, and then somehow it would be dark, and I wouldn't remember lunch. Lisa said it was normal, part of recovery. She had a word for everything: post-anesthesia fatigue, age-related confusion, seasonal affective something. I nodded like a polite patient. The truth is, I was too tired to argue. It's easy to be manipulated when your body betrays you first. Once, I tried skipping a dose, just to see if it made a difference. That day, I felt clear, sharp, almost myself again. I noticed the dust on the window frame, the faint stain on the carpet by the crib they kept for the baby, even the way Lisa's voice tensed when I asked about my mail. But that night, when she brought my tea, she said, "You forgot your vitamins this morning. That's why you're restless. You need them." I took them again obediently. I didn't yet know obedience could be fatal. Looking back, the signs were all there. The way she'd hover in the doorway to check if I'd swallowed. The way Adam started talking about assisted living for the future. The way they moved my purse from the table to the locked cabinet for safekeeping. I thought it was love in a language I'd never learned. I used to believe cruelty had to sound loud to be real. It doesn't. It can wear perfume and bring you soup. It can tuck you in at night and whisper that you're lucky. The day I moved here, after everything came out, I found the old pill organizer in my suitcase pocket. The capsules had hardened, yellowed slightly. I keep them in a jar on the windowsill, not as revenge, as proof. Proof that I wasn't imagining the fog, the trembling hands, the disappearing days. Proof that politeness almost killed me. People ask how I'm doing now. I tell them I sleep through the night without help. I water my peace lily. I make coffee strong enough to taste like something. I'm still here, awake in the small hours when the city hums like a tired machine. I think about all the women who will be told to rest, to take what's offered, to stop asking questions. And I want to tell them, quietly but firmly, read the label. Always read the label. The day everything began to unravel was an ordinary morning, one of those gray, shapeless mornings when the light itself feels sedated. I had woken up later than usual, my tongue thick, my limbs weighted, and for a moment I couldn't remember where I was. The window showed a yard I did not recognize, trimmed bushes, the glint of Lisa's silver SUV, and beyond that, the restless shimmer of a suburban street I never learned the name of. I tried to stand, but my knees trembled, and the world tilted gently like a slow carousel. Lisa appeared in the doorway holding a mug. "You missed your tea," she said, smiling, but there was something brittle about that smile, something stretched too tight across her pretty face. I mumbled that I wasn't hungry, and she sighed the way people sigh when a child refuses a meal. "You must keep to the routine," she said, setting the cup down beside my bed. "Your body depends on stability." Her voice was calm, reasonable, and I wanted to believe her. I took the cup and drank, because drinking was easier than arguing. She lingered until I swallowed the 2 beige capsules from the saucer, watching with that faint managerial patience I had begun to dread. By noon, I was asleep again, though I don't remember lying down. The next clear image I have is of the doctor's office, the smell of antiseptic and something faintly floral, the way the paper on the exam table crackled beneath me. Lisa had driven me there, saying I needed a checkup, and she waited outside while I saw the physician. I remember trying to describe how I felt, foggy, slowed, distant, but my words came out wrong, like puzzle pieces that didn't fit together. The doctor, a young man with kind eyes and a receding hairline, frowned as he asked about my medications. I told him Lisa handled them, that they were vitamins for my nerves, and he gave me a look that was not unkind but careful, as if he were stepping across a floor that might collapse. He asked if I had the bottle with me, and I handed him the small plastic container Lisa kept on my nightstand. He read the label, then turned it slightly under the light, his expression shifting from curiosity to alarm. He asked me to wait a moment and left the room, the door closing with that soft, professional hush that always precedes bad news. When he returned, he was holding a second identical bottle from the sample cabinet, and he spoke very quietly, like someone addressing a frightened animal. "Mrs. Kane," he said, "these aren't vitamins." "Do you know what these are?" I shook my head, and he told me the chemical name, a long word I didn't recognize, then added, "They're a sedative, a tranquilizer, actually, used for large animals in smaller doses." I stared at him, certain I'd misheard. He must have seen the confusion on my face because he sat down beside me and said, "They can be dangerous, especially for someone your age. If you've been taking them daily, we need to run some tests." For a long time, I couldn't form a sentence. I just kept thinking of Lisa's hand, placing those capsules by my tea, the gentle tone she used, the way she always reminded me to take them right after breakfast. I heard myself say, "She said they were vitamins, my daughter-in-law." He nodded slowly and asked if she was a nurse or pharmacist. I laughed, a dry, bitter sound that startled us both. "No," I said, "she decorates houses." He didn't smile. He took a small blood sample and said he'd call me with the results within a day. I walked out into the waiting room, the fluorescent lights flickering, and Lisa stood up from her chair, phone in hand, her expression sharp with expectation. "Everything fine?" she asked, and I heard myself answer yes, because what else could I say in that moment? The car ride home was quiet, except for the sound of the turn signal and the rhythmic hum of tires on asphalt. She didn't ask about the appointment, and I didn't volunteer. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling fan turning above me, I thought about what the doctor had said, about the way his eyes had softened with pity, and for the first time in months, I didn't take the pills. I slipped them into a tissue and tucked them into the drawer. I expected to lie awake all night, but instead I felt my mind clearing, like a fog lifting over a field after rain. The next morning, the doctor called. His voice was firm, stripped of any pretense of calm. He told me the dosage levels in my blood were dangerously high, that another few weeks could have caused organ damage or worse. "You could have died," he said simply. The words were so plain, they didn't sound real. I thanked him automatically, hung up, and sat on the edge of the bed until the sunlight shifted across the floor. Lisa knocked on the door a moment later, her tone bright and brisk. "Morning, Mom. Time for your vitamins." I looked at the cup in her hand, at the beige capsules resting like seeds of sleep, and I smiled, though my voice when I spoke came from somewhere colder. "Not today, dear. I think I've had enough." After that morning, the air in the house changed, though no one said a word about it. Lisa's smile tightened like a drawstring, and her voice took on a honeyed brightness that fooled everyone but me. She began hovering again, reminding me of meal times, reminding me to rest, reminding me that consistency keeps the mind clear. I could see her watching from the corner of her eye whenever I lifted a glass or reached for a bottle, and I understood that she was measuring me, calculating how much of me had returned. I kept up the act, slow and compliant, the way a bird pretends to be wounded to draw danger away from its nest. When she handed me the tea, I nodded and pretended to drink, but I would pour it into the sink later, watching the pale liquid spiral away. Every evening, Adam would come home late and tired, kiss her cheek, and ask politely if I was doing better. She always answered before I could speak, saying that my confusion came and went, that she was managing my schedule, that the new vitamins were helping. He would nod absently, already looking at his phone. I began to understand how easy it was for cruelty to hide inside efficiency. The days moved like a slow tide. Small things began to vanish again. My letters, a necklace Derek had given me, my old checkbook. Lisa explained each loss with cheerful logic. "Oh, you misplace things sometimes. Don't worry, Mom." And her voice wrapped around the lie like silk. I stopped correcting her. Instead, I started writing notes to myself in tiny script, hiding them in my novels and under the mattress, small records of reality, so I could be sure later that I hadn't dreamed it all. On Tuesday, I noticed she had changed my pill organizer. The lids were different colors, brighter, and when I opened one compartment, it was empty. She said the pharmacy had switched brands. I nodded, and when she left the room, I slipped the container into my robe pocket and hid it under the bathroom sink. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed and tried to recall the sequence of the last weeks, the doctor's warning, Lisa's false concern, Adam's distant kindness. The pattern emerged like a stain through thin fabric. Each moment of care had been a step toward disappearance. I began to move carefully, almost theatrically. I pretended to nap when she expected it, kept my eyes half closed at breakfast, hummed softly to suggest harmlessness. It wasn't fear that kept me quiet. It was strategy. Fear is noisy and burns fast, but strategy hums low and steady. I needed time. When Adam left for a business trip, Lisa became almost relaxed, humming as she cooked, her voice echoing down the hall in that airy, self-satisfied way. She was confident again, certain I was contained. I took advantage of her distraction to search the house. In the laundry room, behind a row of cleaning supplies, I found a brown paper bag filled with bottles, different labels, some veterinary, some in plain plastic, all half full. My name wasn't on any of them. I remember sitting on the cold tile floor, holding one of the bottles up to the light, feeling the weight of the tablets shift like sand inside. There was no anger yet, only a strange stillness. I took one bottle, just one, and slipped it into the pocket of my cardigan. The next morning, I told her I was feeling better, that I might try a walk around the neighborhood. Her smile faltered for half a second, then returned stronger. Of course, Mom, but don't overdo it. I promised I wouldn't. The sky was the color of metal that day, and the air smelled of cut grass. I walked slowly to the pharmacy 2 blocks away, the bottle heavy in my pocket, and asked the pharmacist quietly if he could tell me what it was. He studied the label, frowned, and looked up at me as if I had just handed him a confession. "This isn't something you should have," he said, his voice low. "Where did you get it?" I didn't answer. I thanked him, took the bottle back, and walked out before he could ask again. The truth was already too big to fit into a conversation. When I returned, Lisa was waiting on the porch, arms crossed, pretending she had been watering the plants. "You should have told me you were going out," she said lightly, but the muscle in her jaw twitched. I apologized, explained that I needed air, and she accepted the excuse with exaggerated grace. That night, she brought me chamomile tea, a peace offering. I watched her hands as she stirred the cup, steady, practiced. She didn't drink any herself. I waited until she left, then poured it down the drain. The next morning, she replaced the sugar bowl with a sealed jar of honey and told me it was better for my digestion. I didn't argue. The walls of the house seemed to hum with her control, every surface curated, every sound measured. But something inside me had sharpened. I wasn't drifting anymore. I had names of chemicals scribbled in a notebook, a doctor's card hidden in a shoe, and the slow, gathering certainty that my life was no longer safe within these walls. What frightened me most wasn't what Lisa might do, but how easily I had let it happen. There's a peculiar shame in realizing that your own manners became the instrument of your undoing. Each "thank you" had been another turn of the lock. One evening, I found Adam's briefcase open on the kitchen counter, papers, bank forms, insurance documents, and tucked between them, a file with my name on it. It wasn't just about my medical care. It was about my accounts, my property. The house smelled faintly of lavender cleaner. The television murmured in the distance, and upstairs the baby cried once before falling silent. I knew then that whatever love I had believed in here was gone, replaced by management. I was no longer family. I was a responsibility being prepared for disposal. The next morning, when Lisa said, "You should rest today," I smiled sweetly and said, "Yes, dear, after I make a few calls." She didn't ask who I was calling. She thought I'd forgotten how to matter. I woke before the house did, the sky a thin, washed linen, and the hall still holding the night's cool, and I lay very still and listened to the soft ticks and sighs of a place that believed it had me, and I understood in a slow, widening way that the only person who could change the temperature of my life was the woman in that bed. So I slid my hand under the mattress where I had hidden the small notebook and the doctor's card, and I read the chemical names I had copied in my careful librarian script, tasting each syllable like a secret I had finally earned. And I felt the first true flicker of agency in months. Not a blaze and not a speech, just the firming of a spine that had been asked to bend too often. I dressed with a deliberateness that felt ceremonial, not for anyone who might see me, because no one looked at me here unless they needed to, but for the old self who was watching from the doorway and waiting to be invited back. And I tucked the notebook into the pocket of my cardigan, tied my scarf as if nodding a decision, and walked to the kitchen where the neat little cup already waited beside the mug. 2 beige seeds of sleep planted in porcelain. I smiled the kind of grandmother's smile that people mistake for harmlessness. Raised the cup, let the capsules touch my tongue, and then, with my back turned to the security of her gaze, folded them into my cheek like a small theater trick and washed nothing down. When Lisa left to take a call and I heard her voice become brisk in the hall, I spit the softened capsules into a napkin, pressed the damp paper flat, slid it into the lining of my robe where I had unpicked a tiny seam the night before, with the point of a safety pin, and I stood there a moment with the kettle hissing and the sun just finding the edge of the counter, and I thought of all the mornings I had given away because I believed being good would be repaid with good, and I decided that if goodness lived anywhere, now it lived in accuracy, in counting, in dates and labels, and the quiet labor of proof. I called the doctor from the downstairs bathroom, the only room with a fan loud enough to cover my voice, and when he answered, I said my name in a tone that surprised me with its steadiness, and I told him I had the bottle and the napkin and the notebook, and he said he could see me at 2, and that if anyone asked, I should say I felt faint and needed fresh air. I thanked him, not in the apologetic way of a supplicant, but as one professional thanks another for clear instructions, and I hid the phone again under the stack of towels where I had carved a hollow with my hands, and returned to the kitchen where Lisa was arranging fruit into a symmetrical kindness on a white plate. She told me I looked pale and suggested a nap, and I said I might sit by the window instead, and she approved as if she had invented sunlight, and I took my place in the armchair that faced the small square of yard, and I practiced what women of my generation were trained to do, which is to look like we are resting while our minds measure the room, the exits, the habits of the jailer, the soft places in the schedule where a body might slip through. When Adam called at lunch to say he would be late again, and to ask, out of obligation, not curiosity, if I was doing all right, I said I felt clear today, and Lisa leaned over the back of the chair with an affectionate hand on my shoulder that did not quite land, and told him I had had a downturn, but we were managing, and I saw then, in the glass pane, reflected faintly against the pale yard, the tableau of our life, a woman held between the authority of a son who would not look too closely and the administrative devotion of a daughter-in-law who wanted the house to be quieter than a living person allows. At 1:30, I asked for the mail, a harmless errand to the box at the end of the drive that would explain the cardigan and the shoes and the purse. And when Lisa hesitated, I said gently that I wanted to feel the weather on my face, and she agreed, because denial looks ugly in daylight, and I walked down the path slower than I felt, not to perform frailty, but to honor the body that had carried me this far. And at the corner, instead of turning back, I kept walking toward the bus stop that I had seen from the window on dull afternoons, and I rode 3 stops with the bottle tight in my bag and my breath measured so the old fear would not run faster than me. The clinic smelled again of antiseptic and faint flowers, and the nurse knew my name before I spoke because the doctor had called ahead, and he met me in a small room with blinds that did not quite close, and he did not waste words. He said we would document the pills. He would photograph the label. He would log the batch number. He would draw blood again, and he asked if I felt safe going back to the house. I told him safety had become a complicated word, that I could play the part for a little longer if it meant finishing the ledger. And he nodded as one might nod at a colleague who has chosen the harder method because it yields the better answer. He gave me a simple instruction written on a small blue card. Do not ingest anything you did not open yourself. Keep drinking water. Call this number if pressure increases. And the number was not just the clinic. It was the local office that watches. When elders are turned into furniture, and he said quietly that an investigator would likely call me within 48 hours, and that I should not be ashamed of the waiting, because waiting, in a case like this, is work. It is patience shaped like self-preservation. I left by the side door he indicated, the one that let me blend with the mothers and their strollers, and the courier dropping off packages, and I stood in the low winter light, holding the small paper bag they had given me with a vitamin brand I had chosen myself, and a receipt with my own name printed in unfussy letters, and the ordinariness of it nearly undid me because it revealed how long I had survived on someone else's labels. On the bus back, I watched a little boy press his forehead to the glass and name the colors of the cars as they passed, and I felt the memory of my own boy naming things years ago when naming still connected us, not managed me, and I decided that if Adam ever looked at me with that open face again, I would meet it. But if he kept looking away, I would not follow his gaze into the clean, ownerless silence where he felt safest. At the house, Lisa was arranging towels, lavender-scented and stacked like an advertisement, and she asked if I found the mail, and I said yes, and I carried the clinic bag into my room as if it contained only lotion, and I locked the door for the first time since I arrived, and I placed the napkin and the bottle and the notebook on the bedspread in a careful row, and I took a photograph with the little phone I had learned to use badly but bravely, and I emailed it to the address on the blue card with a subject line that read simply, record, and I felt a current move through me that was not anger and not relief, something steadier and cooler, the feeling of a woman returning to her profession, even when the profession is her own rescue. In the mirror above the dresser, I saw the face I had been avoiding, a softness around the mouth that grief had sown there, eyes a little dulled from months in a fog not of my making, and I touched my cheek with a palm that still remembered the weight of babies and books and plates and hands of people I had loved, and I said, almost joking and almost prayerful, that I would take it from here, and the woman in the glass did not argue. When Lisa knocked to ask if I wanted chamomile, I said I wanted plain water with lemon, and she hesitated because water does not obey. And then she brought it, and I drank it and thanked her with a voice that had sand in it now. And when she suggested an afternoon rest, I said I would prefer to sit by the window and read, and I took down the small hardback I had hidden the notebook inside, and I opened to the chapter where the heroine stops apologizing, and I let the words stiffen my spine, and I stayed there until the light left the room, and in that slow dimming, I felt the quiet tectonic shift of a life turning toward itself, not with trumpets or slammed doors, but with accurate lists, clean water, a phone number written on a blue card, and the decision to stop being easy to manage. The pressure did not announce itself with shouting or with doors slammed hard enough to rattle picture frames. It arrived like a weather front that had been gathering just beyond the horizon, a slow darkening of the domestic sky that turned every ordinary moment into a test of submission. And the first sign was Adam arriving home early with a cautious smile and a leather folder tucked under his arm, saying he had taken the afternoon off because he wanted to help with paperwork, while Lisa hovered in the kitchen arranging grapes with the solemnity of a pharmacist counting pills. And when we sat at the table, he opened the folder and produced a stack of forms with pale blue signatures printed in the margins, explaining with the patter of a man who sells safety that these were standard documents, nothing alarming, just a durable power of attorney and a simple medical directive so that if anything ever happened, the family could act quickly. And I watched his eyes as he spoke, saw how they skittered away from the steady look I offered him like fish avoiding a shadow. And I said gently that I appreciated his concern and that I would take them to my own lawyer to review, which startled him more than if I had shouted, because he had. Not accounted for an old woman who still uses the phrase "my own" with the same quiet force she used when she kept a household afloat on coupons and bone broth and stubborn arithmetic. Lisa arrived with tea, the cup set just so on a saucer like a ceremonial offering, and when I did not touch it, she gave Adam a look that was polished to look like worry, and he cleared his throat and said he was only trying to protect me because the world is complex and predators target the elderly, and I heard the sentence click into place inside my chest, not as an accusation, but as a key with two sides, because I understood that he believed it while not seeing that the predator had a manicure and my address. I told him I had a doctor's appointment the next day, and that perhaps we could revisit everything after I'd rested. And he said, of course, always in that tone that suggests there is a hidden calendar where your name is penciled in as a problem to be resolved. And after he left the room, Lisa moved closer, the friendly tilt of her head sharpened by a different gravity. And she said softly that she had read an article about elder scams, and that sometimes confusion can feel like clarity to the person inside it. And I smiled at the ceiling light and said I would keep that in mind. That night I slept in little shallow ponds of consciousness, the kind where you wake believing you've been called, but no one has spoken. And at 3 I sat in the armchair and made the smallest plan a human can make, which is to keep breathing while doing only honest things. And in the morning I called the number on the blue card from the clinic and spoke to a woman whose voice carried the fatigue of witness and the steadiness of a metronome, and she asked simple questions and did not rush my answers, and she told me an investigator would reach out quietly and that if possible, I should keep the routine unchanged until a visit could be arranged. And the phrase, "keep the routine unchanged," felt like swallowing a pebble, because I knew routine was the leash in this house, but I also knew that a leash can be used to lead something out of danger if you hold it yourself. The increase in control came quickly after that, as if my refusal had sent a tremor through their system. Lisa began to insist on standing in the doorway when I spoke on the phone, pretending to fluff curtains or water a plant that did not require water. The sugar was replaced with a solid jar that required 2 hands to open and conveniently stuck when my wrists ached. My purse migrated again to a high cabinet with a key I never saw, and Adam started leaving pamphlets on assisted living. Communities folded open to photographs of cheerful dining halls and men my age playing checkers like they had spent their lives wanting to be contained. He spoke of amenities and predictable care and said it would be a relief for everyone, and I heard in his voice the exhausting love of a man who wanted to stop thinking about his mother by arranging her out of sight. In those days, the house developed a second soundtrack under the usual clinks and murmurs, the soft ping of text messages exchanged out of earshot, the double click of the cabinet lock, the careful hush of Lisa's slippers approaching at medication. Time and once, the low, urgent murmur of Adam saying, "She's lucid again, at least today," which was said like an inconvenience rather than a blessing, and something in me steadied with a hardness I had not felt since the years when I stood in front of a board of men who did not want to fund the library and taught them the mathematics of community. The investigator called while Lisa was out, a woman named Rivera, who asked if I could meet her not at the house, but at the clinic where the doctor could join us, and we set a time that felt like a small flag planted on a private map. And when Lisa returned, she suggested, in the sing-song of a preschool teacher, that we try a different supplement because the last one seemed to make me moody. And I agreed with such gentle docility that I almost convinced myself, then later removed the new capsules from the organizer with the tip of a spoon and folded them into the napkin that had become my second ledger. Adam brought being difficult when everyone was trying to make things easier. And I answered that easier is a word that sometimes means for you. And he flinched as if I had hit him, not because the sentence was cruel, but because it was accurate. And accuracy has a way of cracking the lacquer. The next morning, a stranger arrived with a tote bag printed with the logo of a home care agency, a brisk woman whose smile was shaped like a checklist, and she introduced herself as a wellness coach who would be supporting the family. And I realized this was either a preemptive defense or an attempt to install a witness who would say the right things later. I greeted her warmly, offered water, and answered her questions with the measured candor of a person who has spent a lifetime doing reference interviews. And when she asked about my medications, I said I preferred to discuss prescriptions with my physician. And I watched her jot something down in a shorthand that looked like compliance but smelled like strategy. That afternoon, perhaps because she felt the winds shifting, Lisa's tone sharpened. She stood in my doorway and told me that if I continued to create drama, she would have no choice but to set boundaries. And I heard the sentence as a child might. Hear thunder rolling in, not yet danger, but undeniable weather. And I thanked her for her clarity and said my boundary was that I would not ingest anything I did not open myself. And the look she gave me then was almost tender, the kind of look some people give a stray dog who bares its teeth from hunger, because she believed I could be coaxed back into docility with the right combination of sweetness and pressure. 2 nights later, the police knocked softly, a welfare check requested, they said, by a concerned family member, and I realized that the narrative was being arranged like furniture. The vulnerable elder, the selfless children, the difficult facts to be tidied away beneath throws, and I stepped onto the porch and spoke to the officers with my steady voice, told them I was under medical care, told them I was safe that evening, and expected a follow-up with a state investigator. And when they left, with polite nods, I returned to the living room where Lisa sat with her legs crossed and the television on mute, a still life of composure. And she asked why I always chose the hard way when she was trying to give me an easy life. And I said that Sometimes the easy life is just a soft room in a locked building, and she turned up the volume so the sentence would not echo. The day of the meeting, I told her I was going to the clinic to ask about a rash, and she offered to drive. But I said I would take the bus because the air did me good. And in the small consultation room, the doctor and Ms. Rivera listened as I laid out the dates, the bottles, the photographs, and I watched their faces become professionally motionless in that way that means the facts have crossed a threshold from troubling to actionable. And Ms. Rivera asked if I had somewhere safe to go, if the house became untenable, and I said that safety was a work in progress, but that I had the small beginnings of a plan, and she nodded and said that plans do not have to be grand to be sufficient. They have to be real. Back at the house, the tempo increased again, as if someone had sped the metronome. My room was reorganized while I was in the bath. The notebook I kept beneath my pillow migrated to the laundry basket and returned with a scent that was not mine. Adam called twice in a single afternoon to check whether I had made a decision, and a glossy brochure appeared on my bedspread with a handwritten note. "We love you. We want what's best. Please don't make this harder than it has to be." And for the first time, a tear slid down without my permission, not because the sentence convinced me, but because the boy who used to fall asleep on my chest had learned to write a plea that made his comfort the measure of my goodness. That evening, I asked for my purse, and Lisa said it was safer where she kept it, and I said I needed my identification for a routine errand tomorrow, and she hesitated just long enough to confirm the habit, then fetched it with a smile and a warning about misplacing things, and I thanked her and held the strap like a handle to a door I had nearly forgotten. When the house finally settled into its curated quiet, I sat at the small desk by the window and took out a pen and wrote a letter that was not the last letter, but the first honest one in a long time, addressed to myself by name and written in the present tense, a page of simple assertions. I will not be made smaller to fit inside someone else's good intentions. I will not buy peace with my pulse. I will not confuse management for love. And when I finished, I folded it and slid it into the pocket of the navy coat I had not worn in months, and I slept with the blue card under my pillow like a passport. In the days that followed, the house seemed to exist in two exposures, the visible one where breakfast was served and lawns were trimmed and neighborly nods were exchanged, and the other, overlaid, where the air had the metallic taste of strategy and every kindness arrived with paperwork attached, and living in both without losing the thread of my own narrative felt like walking a beam across a shallow river, not deep enough to drown me, but cold enough to make me fall if I looked down. So I kept my eyes on the bank where the path curved toward a gate I was finally ready to unlatch. The call came just before dawn, the kind of hour when the world still feels unfinished, when the birds have not yet agreed to believe in morning. And for a moment, I thought it was another wrong number until I heard the measured voice that said, my name, and identified herself as Rivera. She spoke slowly, explaining that the authorities were ready to proceed, that the documentation I had provided was enough to open a formal case, and that they would need to collect the pills from the house before evidence could be tampered with. I listened in silence, watching the pale stripe of light creep across the carpet, and when she asked if I was safe to cooperate, I said yes, though my heart beat in the rhythm of someone remembering what risk used to feel like when she was young and believed in second chances. She instructed me to pack a small bag under the pretext of a medical stay, to have it ready but not visible, and she would arrive at the clinic with a plainclothes officer that afternoon. When I hung up, I sat at the edge of the bed with my hand pressed to the wooden frame, feeling the vibration of the dryers downstairs through the floorboards, and I realized that the world was already rearranging itself around a single, irreversible choice. In the kitchen, Lisa was humming, the tune sweet but relentless, and when she turned and saw me, she said she was surprised I was up so early. I told her I had a follow-up appointment to check my blood pressure, nothing serious, and that the doctor wanted me to bring the vitamins so he could compare ingredients. For the first time in weeks, she hesitated. A flicker of calculation crossed her face before she smiled and said, "That was a good idea. Transparency builds trust." I returned to my room and opened the drawer where I had kept the bottle she thought was empty, the one I had switched weeks earlier. I placed it in my purse beside the notebook and the blue card, and I slipped the folded letter I had written to myself on top of it, as if the truth might need a companion. The hours before noon stretched like a wire. Adam called to say he would be home for dinner, that they wanted to talk about future arrangements, and I could hear Lisa prompting him in the background, her voice a hiss just out of range. I answered warmly, the tone of a woman still grateful for being remembered, and when he hung up, I allowed myself a long breath, a rehearsal of the voice I would need to use later, when calmness would matter more than fear. Just before 1, Lisa appeared in the doorway, holding a shawl, and said she would drive me, and I smiled as though relieved. The ride to the clinic passed under a heavy sky, the air outside restless with wind. She talked about the baby's sleeping schedule and a new client who wanted marble countertops, and I answered with small noises, the polite hum of a passenger who does not plan to return by the same route. When we parked, she offered to wait inside, but I said the doctor expected me alone, and after a moment she agreed, perhaps reassured by the predictability of my obedience. Inside, the clinic smelled faintly of antiseptic and paper. Rivera was waiting in the corridor with the doctor, both dressed plainly enough to disappear in any crowd. The doctor greeted me as though this were an ordinary appointment, leading me to a side room where a metal tray and a sealed evidence bag already waited. I handed over the bottle, the napkin, and the photographs from my phone, each object leaving my hands with the weight of months. Rivera asked me to confirm the details one last time, and I repeated them steadily, the dates, the dosages, the pattern of control, until the narrative no longer felt like mine, but a case file that might someday be read by someone who would see in it the map of their own awakening. When it was done, she said quietly that officers were en route to the house, that they would retrieve the rest of the medication and any financial documents, and that it would be better if I didn't return there tonight. The sentence struck like a sudden change in air pressure. I was being extracted from my life, not as punishment, but as rescue. I sat very still while she made a few phone calls, my eyes tracing the cracks in the ceiling paint, thinking of all the ceilings I had stared at while pretending to nap, counting the hours I had mistaken for rest. Around 3, a nurse came in with tea and a small sandwich, the kind gesture of a profession that still believes in the healing power of food, and I ate slowly, not because I was hungry, but because it anchored me to the ordinary. An hour later, Rivera returned, her expression calm but definitive. They had confirmed the drugs were controlled substances, traced to a veterinary supplier. Lisa had been taken in for questioning, and Adam had followed voluntarily. I asked nothing, not because I didn't want to know, but because I had already imagined every version of the outcome, and in each one I was free. The doctor arranged for me to stay overnight for observation, a word that sounded gentle enough to cover what it truly meant. Sanctuary. In the small hospital room, the sheets smelled of starch. The window overlooked a parking lot, and yet it felt expansive, the first space in a long time that did not echo with someone else's will. I spent the evening writing, first a list of things I had to remember, bank contacts, the address of the new apartment the social worker had mentioned, the date of the hearing, and then a second list of things I would never again apologize for: survival, anger, the need for solitude, the right to be believed. Around midnight, a nurse brought a small cup of pills for sleep, and I smiled, thanked her, and placed them on the bedside table untouched. The gesture was not defiance, but punctuation, the quiet full stop at the end of a long grammatical error. I lay awake listening to the hum of fluorescent lights and thought of the house on the quiet street, of Lisa's immaculate counters and Adam's careful absences, and I wondered if they were sitting now under those same lights, answering questions from strangers who could not be charmed. I did not feel vengeance, only a fatigue so deep it bordered on peace. In the morning, Rivera came to check on me. She said charges had been filed: elder abuse, prescription fraud, financial exploitation, and that I would be kept informed as the case progressed. I thanked her and asked what would happen to them, and she said the system would take its course, which sounded both reassuring and unknowable. Before leaving, she placed a small card on the table with her personal number. "You can call any time," she said. "Freedom takes adjustment." After she left, I opened the blinds and let the winter light flood the room. For a long while, I simply watched dust motes move in the sunbeam, the simplest evidence of air, and I realized that I could breathe without counting the cost. By the time the nurse returned with breakfast, I had already decided to move into the apartment the agency had arranged, a modest place near a park, close enough to walk to the library. When she asked if I wanted my tea sweetened, I smiled and said I preferred it plain. Later that day, as they wheeled me toward the discharge area, I passed a small waiting room where a woman sat with her mother, their heads bent together over a magazine. The daughter looked impatient, the mother resigned, and for a heartbeat I saw myself duplicated in both of them, the giver and the taker of permission. I wanted to tell them to be kind before it calcified, but the moment moved past. Outside, the air smelled of rain and disinfectant, clean enough to start over. The cab that took me to my new home was driven by a young man who hummed softly to himself, and I let the sound fill the space where fear used to live. The building was old, the elevator slow, the walls thin, and yet when I stepped inside the little apartment with its single window and second-hand chair, I felt something settle in my bones, the small click of a lock that turns from the inside. I unpacked carefully, placing the peace lily on the sill, the notebook on the desk, the empty pill bottle beside it as a relic. And when the sun dropped low, I brewed a cup of strong coffee, the smell rising like a declaration. I sat by the window and watched people cross the street, each carrying their own invisible wars, and I thought of the word recovery, how it means both healing and reclamation, and I understood that mine had been both. That night, as I drifted toward sleep without chemical help, I whispered a single sentence into the quiet room. I am awake now, and that is enough. In the months that followed, the days began to take on a rhythm that no longer depended on anyone's approval. A quiet, deliberate tempo, built of small decisions that were wholly mine. And at first, that autonomy felt fragile, like a bird cupped too, tightly in the hands, but with each sunrise it learned how to breathe on its own. I would wake early and sit by the window with my coffee, watching the city come alive, the people on the sidewalks with their bags and their thoughts and their reasons for moving forward. And I would remind myself that I was one of them again, unremarkable, unobserved, free. The case wound its way through the courts, and though I received updates from Rivera now and then, I stopped counting the hearings. The story no longer belonged to me once it entered the machinery of justice. What belonged to me was the silence I had reclaimed, the slow hum of my own mind, waking without permission. Sometimes in the evenings, I would find myself rehearsing old conversations, testing the edges of forgiveness like a sore tooth. I wanted to believe I could reach it someday, not because they deserved it, but because I wanted to live unweighted. When the verdict came, Rivera called to say that Lisa had accepted a plea deal, probation, and mandatory counseling, and that Adam had cooperated enough to avoid charges but would have a mark on his professional record. I thanked her politely and hung up, and afterward I sat for a long time with my hands folded in my lap, not triumphant, not grieving, just still. There are victories that arrive too late to feel like triumphs. They resemble closure the way a scar resembles skin. I went to the park near my building almost every afternoon. There was a wooden bench by a pond where ducks gathered, and I would bring breadcrumbs, or sometimes just sit with a book I rarely read. The peace lily on my windowsill began to bloom again, small white petals opening like cautious forgiveness, and I took it as a sign that even damaged things can practice continuity. Occasionally I saw other older women there, some walking dogs, some sitting alone like me, and now and then one of them would glance at me and smile with that wordless recognition of shared survival, as though we were members of a quiet order that needed no creed. One of them, a retired teacher named Margaret, started joining me on the bench. She spoke about her grandchildren, her arthritis, her late husband who had been kind but silent, and I listened, hearing in her voice the echoes of all the women who have learned to make small talk around the edges of their own erasure. Eventually, she asked about my family, and I told her carefully edited truths, that my son lived out of town, that my daughter-in-law and I had grown distant, that time does strange things to affection. She nodded and said, "It does, but it doesn't erase it." And I smiled because she didn't know how wrong and how right she was at the same time. I started volunteering at the public library on Thursdays, helping with the senior reading group. The first day I walked in and smelled the paper and dust. I felt something inside me align, like a compass finding its direction after too long spinning. The women in the group were all in their 70s and 80s, each with her own story of dislocation or resilience, and they read slowly, savoring words as if language itself were medicine. One afternoon we read a poem about survival, and one of them, a widow named Clara, said she wished she had been braver in her life. I looked at her and said, "Bravery doesn't always look loud. Sometimes it's just staying awake when someone wants you asleep." The room went quiet in that way only truth can manage, and afterward Clara squeezed my hand. I think she knew. The letters from Adam began arriving around that time, at first short, then longer. Apologies written in the hesitant script of a man who has met his own cowardice. I read them all, though I never replied. He wrote that he hadn't known, that he'd believed Lisa's stories about my confusion, that he thought he was helping me. I believed him in the way one believes that rain falls without malice. It doesn't make you any less wet. Eventually, I placed the letters in a drawer and stopped expecting them to explain anything. What mattered was not whether he understood what had been done, but whether I could continue living without needing that understanding. And I did. On the anniversary of the day I left the house, I brewed a pot of tea and sat by the window as the afternoon light turned gold. The city outside seemed softer, as if distance had taught me how to see it kindly. I took the empty pill bottle from the shelf, peeled away the remaining piece of label, and dropped a small sprig of lavender inside. It looked less like evidence now and more like an artifact, proof not of what had hurt me, but of what I had refused to become. Later that week, I received a call from the animal shelter near the park. Months ago, I had filled out a volunteer form and forgotten about it. The woman on the line said they needed someone calm to help with the rehabilitation of rescued horses, that it wasn't heavy work, mostly reading aloud to them and sitting quietly so they'd grow used to gentle voices. For a long time, I couldn't speak. Then I laughed, an unguarded, full-bodied laugh that startled even me. And I said, yes, I could do that. I hung up and looked around my little apartment at the peace lily and the stack of books, and thought how strange and perfect it was that life sometimes finds a symmetry we never plan. The next morning, I took the bus to the shelter. The field smelled of hay and rain, and one of the handlers led me to a stable where a tall chestnut horse stood blinking in the sunlight. "He's nervous," she said. "Takes a while to trust." I nodded and stepped closer until I could feel his breath warm against my hand. I spoke softly, telling him my name, telling him he was safe now, and as he lowered his head, I realized that I was speaking to both of us. That night, back in my apartment, I sat by the open window, the air sweet with spring, and I wrote in my notebook a single line: "No one gets to decide when you stop mattering." Then I closed it and let the city hum carry me toward sleep, unmedicated, unafraid, fully awake in a life that was mine again.